Percy Jackson and the Olympians and Netflix Avatar The Last Airbender are two sides of the same coin, a mediocre adaptation at best and entirely forgettable, downright disrespectful to the original and to the audience at worst. So how can we discern this for ourselves? How can we tell the difference between a bad adaptation and a truly compelling one? So much of this comes down to emotions and character, the heart and soul of the story. The devil is not in the insignificant details, like making costumes a carbon copy, or the fight scenes shot-by-shot replica, but in the core of who these people are, why do they do what they do, and what does it tell us? Let me prefix this by saying I understand that changes need to happen when adapting a book into a movie or an animation into live action. It's a different medium, it has its own rules, no one is trying to dispute that. Also, not everyone who criticizes modern TV and movies is a purist. I believe one of the best adaptations in history is Lord of the Rings by Peter Jackson. But if you were to ask any Tolkien enthusiast, myself included, they would tell you exactly what is wrong with it. They would tell you that Frodo was supposed to be 30 years old, not 18, that Arwen never led the Fellowship to Rivendell, that elves never fought in Helm's Deep, and yet it is an adaptation that I would describe as the most faithful, because those details are truly unimportant when the foundation and heart of the story is done right. The same thing cannot be said about Percy Jackson or Avatar, unfortunately. And the first thing we should take under the microscope is the writing. Writing means a lot of things. That's why discussing it can be elusive to a more passive viewer. But what a good writing does is creating a character that feels as real to you as your family member, giving insight into what they are feeling without spelling it out in the dialogue, and creating an arc in the story, the beginning, middle, and end in their journey that shows us who they were, what was holding them back, and who they became in the process. And essential to a good story are good characters. It is a first step in a faithful adaptation. It won't matter if the casting and clothes are perfect, if the character isn't the same person in both stories. Let's take Aang, for example, a mythical avatar, the only one who can use the power of all elements, but who at the core is just a kid, afraid of the responsibility and isolation that being the chosen one forces him into. In the original animation, Aang flees the air tribe consciously in order to avoid being the avatar, gets caught in the storm, and emerges 100 years later to find out that his selfishness and fear led to genocide of his people. In the new version, Aang is left out of the fight by accident. So when later on in the season all characters try to shame him for shirking his responsibilities, it falls flat because this Aang didn't choose anything. He just was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Same thing happens with Katara's character. Now Katara from the animation is a bossy, assertive mother figure of the whole group. Even though Sokka is the elder brother, the writing and characterization tells us that it is Katara who is the more mature and serious one. Her rage and uptightness, created in a trauma response to her mother's violent death, is the foundation of the majority of conflicts that dramatize the show. Throughout the season, Katara proves herself to be a very capable bender, so when we get to the North Pole and Pakku dismisses her just on the basis of her being a girl, we feel the rage she feels because we've seen how powerful she is. In the live action, the unfairness of the situation is undercut by how Katara is written. When watching their fight, I couldn't help but think, do you even want to fight him? Can you really defeat him? Because this Katara didn't do anything earlier in the season to prove herself. The great irony of the writers of this show is that in removing Sokka's sexism, they wrote Katara in the most sexist way imaginable, as a meek, docile doormat that is just there, almost like a prop, not engaging like an active protagonist would. Another huge issue in the writing of these adaptations is the exposition, which is basically explanation revealing important information that is essential for the viewer to properly understand what is happening in the story. And it can be done in a lot of ways. It can be done visually, by cuts in the editing, close-ups on characters' expressions, through action scenes. Basically, the worst crime you can commit with the exposition is straight up tell the viewer in the dialogue what they should be feeling or thinking in this moment.
Leave for where?
Zeus is king on Olympus, and Poseidon has always resented it, but there is a third brother who has always deeply resented them both.
Hades.
Yes.
The bolt is with Hades.
Show, don't tell somehow has slipped modern Hollywood's mind. There are so many instances in both Percy and Avatar when we get excruciatingly long dialogues, over-explaining everything, every thought process these characters have, when instead we should be experiencing it through what happens on the screen. And of course, there are exceptions. Some backstories are difficult to introduce without explanation, but minutes and minutes that compound into hours of unnecessary exposition is just lazy. And it tells me that the writer doesn't trust the viewer to be able to figure it all out on his own. And without trust in the audience's ability to be immersed in this story, you can't convey the emotions of it properly. The dialogue starts feeling clunky, the characters lack chemistry, and relationships feel hollow because the foundation isn't built in the new story, but artificially copied from the original without developing and nurturing it here. At the end of the season, when Annabeth, Percy, and Grover hold each other and promise to return, I felt nothing but frustration because nothing in these episodes allowed them to build a true friendship. They were barely even there under the pile of exposition and unearned plot points. And I'm not talking about acting here, because these poor young actors had nothing in the script to work with. Have you asked yourself why Walker is suddenly so much worse here than he was in Adam's project?
Oh, I'm gonna enjoy this.
Who talks like that? Did you order like a bully starter kit on Amazon or something? I mean, do you even hear yourself, Chuck? We talked about this.
I didn't say anything.
Shut up, Chuck.
It's because his character doesn't have the personality he can then portray on the screen. Same thing happens in Avatar. Not letting the characters grow, transform, and sit with their emotions is also a byproduct of bad editing and pacing. We need time to process emotions. When scenes are edited in a fast-paced manner and the creators are afraid of pathos, every heroic act on the screen will fall flat, because we are not allowed to process it. To this day, show of hands, how many of us remember the sadness we felt when Haldir or Boromir died? Now let me ask you this, will you remember Percy's mom in the same way? There is a formula to how these scenes should be acted, shot, and edited in order to elicit certain emotion. But again, I feel like the creators aren't confident that we won't laugh at them. Everyone is afraid to be the butt of the joke, and the art suffers for it. When done in an earnest way, there is no possibility that the majority of the audience won't feel the gut punch of the character's death if you're not rushing it. Another way to elicit important emotions is through music, the most underused element of modern adaptations. For the life of me, I cannot understand why. Because great soundtrack creates another layer of storytelling, almost like a story within a story. It can evoke emotions no dialogue can. In Avatar, it is barely there as a poor imitation of the original, and in Percy, it is just laughable, with the same basic 5 notes at the end of each episode. Not to mention that it sounds like every soundtrack for every Disney Plus show. You wouldn't be able to differentiate between Percy's, Ahsoka's, or Obi-Wan's theme. Now let me ask you this. Can you hear the music here? Or here? Or here? The bottom line is that unfortunately these adaptations are just not compelling enough to earn the fans organically the same way as the originals have. Everything is either rushed, over-explained, simplified, or changed for the worse. Is the new format of television to blame? For a while now, I wanted to make a bold claim that I believe YA stories should return to movie theaters instead of being wasted on streaming. No one is concerned with properly developing the characters anymore, and instead every show needs to be Endgame or last season of Game of Thrones level event, without the understanding that it took a decade, a literal 10 years of consistent storytelling to get the audience there to the finish line. So, no, the faithfulness is not about copy-pasting the visuals or even a perfect casting, but about the spirit of the original. Without it, every CGI in the world will not save these shows from fading into obscurity. In simpler terms, when adaptation is faithful, you can feel it, even when the details within the story are arranged differently. It elicits the same emotion. Percy Jackson and the Olympians and Avatar: The Last Airbender on Netflix fails at this, because there is nothing worse than a story that makes us feel nothing.